everybody, and welcome to the They Came From panel. They came from the convention floor! And by convention
Ooh.
floor, we mean our separate residences. Because there's no floor at this convention because it's virtual. But yeah, no, we're really excited to be here at Virtual HorrorCon again. I think last time we were here, Beyond the Grave hadn't even come out yet, so now we have twice as many games to talk about.
My
That's true.
God. Mm.
So I'm Dixie Cochran. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the editor-in-chief at Onyx Path Publishing, and I have contributed to a couple of They Came From books. Eddy?
My name is Eddy Webb. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the executive producer at Onyx Path Publishing, and I'm also responsible for many of the Story Path games. Not really, kind of, sort of, that They Came From games as well, but kind of not. And also Pugmire, which is another game I guess we make.
Yeah. We talked about that one already. I don't want to talk about it this panel.
Boo.
And Matthew.
Yes. And I'm Matthew Dawkins. My pronouns are he, him. I am the creative strategist at Onyx Path Publishing and the line developer, conceptualist, artiste, initiator, Guy Fawkes behind the They Came From line.
I do not remember his business card text at all previously.
Well, you've not seen my business card in many years.
That's true. That's true.
It's this big now.
Yes. I always liked, in the Naked Gun movies where he would open his wallet and usually it would be to show a badge, of course, but then everything flaps out, all the credit card, all the membership cards. That's my business card now. I fold it up, concertina it, pass it to someone. It expands like a sponge in the bath, like Lionel Hutz.
I imagine your business titles actually choose your adventure so people can pick and make their way through your title as a quest.
That's a really good idea. I'm a big fan of people who are creative with their business cards, and yet I also realize that no one who's going to hire you is going to spend the time working through a really creative business card because they either want to hire you or they don't. Right. I think it's probably a very small fraction who think, wow, that 300-page choose your own adventure arc that finally led me to your email address will make me hire you.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't do that. No. You can have a creative card without that. I've got creative editing cards that I like, but past that, no, you don't need to do that. That said, we're here to talk about They Came From a series of games. Matthew, do you want to give a little bit of the history? Where did this come from?
No.
Aside from Beneath the Sea.
They come from the convention floor.
Well, whether or not you would like to, please do that.
Yes, it is a story I have never told before, and so brace yourselves because I will make this origin story up. We're in a new 52 realm now.
Wow.
So
Nice.
they came came to me in a dream. It originated as something of a mishmash of sources. I guess a lot of things do. It's rare that a concept comes to you wholly formed, especially for a fully functioning game. And they came from, I sometimes vacillate on this, but I think my first real interest in making a game of my own started with when I ran a game called All Flesh Must Be Dark Place. It was All Flesh Must Be Eaten, using the characters from Garth Marenghi's Dark Place. I allowed the players to have bonuses if they used lines from their characters in Garth Marenghi's Dark Place that were noted on their character sheet as quips or quotes at the time. Now, around that time, I was also playing an awful lot of XCOM Terror from the Deep, which was the sequel to UFO Enemy Unknown on the PlayStation and PC in the mid-90s, and crucially, a horribly hard game. But it really made me want to, and I was playing the Aliens board game. Now, all of these things were coming together in my mind and making me think I would really love to run this quite dry PMC, private military company led game where it's almost post-apocalyptic. Aliens have invaded from the ocean. The world has fallen into corporations warring for dominance. So it's very original concepts, I'm sure you can agree. And you were members of one of these or multiple of these PMCs. And I, even for some reason best known to myself, decided I would adapt the rule set from Leading Edge Games' Alien RPG to emulate it. And I can honestly say that was a poor choice, because I ran that game at a convention twice, and it was the driest, dreariest, least fun game you could play. The only thing that really had an attachment was characters could have quotes, as I had developed for the All Flesh Must Be Dark place. Now, I went back to the drawing board, and as I've always been a big cinephile, big fan of classic movies, often not good ones, I'm a big fan of 1950s sci-fi in particular. I wanted to retain this invasion from the deep angle, but thought it would be better to position it as a B-movie game, a game where things are deliberately looking cheap. I continued to use this quip mechanic. I started coming up with these things called cinematics, where you could use as a meta currency to alter the fundaments of the game, such as having a cheap set that you could run through the wall of if you were being cornered by a monster, or insert a deleted scene to justify why you've now got a rocket launcher, that sort of thing. And all of that kind of came together. There was direction as well, strong direction from Richard Thomas, our creative director at Onyx Path, who mentioned some of the things we should really emphasize. It certainly leaned strongly into the comedy camp as a result of Rich's direction, and it really seemed to work very well. And They Came From Beneath the Sea formed from that. In terms of system, Onyx Path had recently started making games using the story path system. I don't know if all of them or many of them were out at that stage when I started on Beneath the Sea, because I still had the working document for story path from Trinity, as I remember it. And Rich basically said to me, do you want to create your own system? Because I had, by this point, that wasn't the Leading Edge Games Alien system. Or do you want to use StoryPath? I'd like you to have a look at it. So I looked at StoryPath because I hadn't worked on Scion or Trinity or Dystopia Rising, so I wasn't that familiar with it. And I had a look through it and thought, wow, okay, this actually does everything I want They Came From to do. We don't need to create a system from scratch for this game, and we can add on now things like quips and cinematics and tropes as modules, almost bolt-ons that you can choose to use or not. And so with StoryPath as a core, all of the They Came From apparatus floating around it, They Came From Beneath the Sea was born from the depths of the ocean to wreak havoc and humor on role-playing game tables everywhere.
Then it spawned several siblings.
Yes,
kind of
your squidgy, waterlogged siblings.
Yeah, I guess they certainly all have a mote of aquaticism, as I find myself adding maritime horror and conspiracies in pretty much everything.
We have a ghost ship in Beyond the Grave, don't we?
Yeah, Beyond the Grave has got a ghost ship.
It has to.
Yeah, it even has some ghostly pirates, and I think that may be in. Oh, now that's testing me. Which book that is? But anyway. So They Came From Beyond the Grave came next, and this was 1960s and 70s hammer horror, Amicus, Roger Corman-esque movies, a cigarette smoke stained era of horror, where budgets tended to be quite low. They weren't critically appraised. They weren't as farcically crap as the sci-fi of the 1950s, but they were certainly hammy. And very much garish. The blood was in Technicolor, and it was all wow, pop off the screen. And Beyond the Grave was in many ways a more popular experiment than Beneath the Sea. When we released it, I think it did better on Kickstarter, which was interesting. And it's a game that I think the humorous tone is a lot more subtle than that of Beneath the Sea. But it has done very well. People seem to enjoy and acknowledge the fact that they don't run horror games without humor anyway. So even if it's very dark humor, so amplifying the humor a little and diminishing the horror a little actually makes for a very interesting game. And it is arguably my favorite of the cores. I know you shouldn't have a favorite child. And I actually have a child, and I'm still putting Beyond the Grave above him.
Oh, poor Edwin.
But that's the way these things go. And yeah, so Beyond the Grave did well, and then of course went on to spawn Classified, another core book, which was our espionage movies, again 60s 70s era mostly. Bond, well, not Bourne so much, Jason King, The Avengers, Man from U.N.C.L.E., that sort of thing, which is very tightly positioned with Beyond the Grave for my favorite. It's the one I find easiest to run. It's a game that very much has its tongue in cheek. There's lots of innuendos about the place. Lots of. It's not exclusively a British game in feel, but whenever I run it, it tends to be. So there's lots of, now listen here, agent, drink that tea and receive your briefing. Would you care for a macaron? That sort of thing. And it really seems to convey that tone, the sort of fading hippie era through to the sort of grey suits of John le Carré, along with the humor of Austin Powers and Jason King, and a lot of the tongue-in-cheek Emma Peel and John Steed stuff. And then They Came from the Cyclops' Cave, which was a co-developed book. Myself and Michele Masala. Michele pitched the product. I love the idea of it, and we went ahead and did that as our fourth game line. This was fantasy movies, and rather than being era locked, it was very much an expanse of all the way from about like the 1920s silent cinema to the mid-90s of Hercules and Xena, before fantasy movies started getting critically appraised as good.
Anything pre-Lord of the Rings.
Yes, that was basically everything pre-Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. So before people started taking fantasy seriously, obviously there were some fantasy movies that were acclaimed, but it was often seen as a bit of a stepchild to proper cinema, even when movies like Willow and Conan and Labyrinth were actually heralded as, oh, these are actually rather good. It's got a lot in common with those films. It's got Krull, it's got Hawk the Slayer, it's got a lot of Hercules and Xena in it, and all the way back to Sinbad and Hercules' many journeys, including one we watched on for a New Year special on the Onyx Pathcast.
Yeah, they were vampires.
Harryhausen style stop motion fantasy.
Yeah. So those are the big four. Those are how They Came From games. I think it's very, what's most gratifying about the They Came From line for me as the creator, as the developer of these games, primary developer, I suppose, is I don't expect everyone to play every single game, because I think you often have to have a certain vested interest in the genre from which the game is pulling. It's the same for role-playing games in general. But I think what I really enjoy is listening to big fans of horror enjoy Beyond the Grave, big fans of sci-fi enjoy Beneath the Sea, because they're applying their own knowledge, their own nostalgia to these games. And they are not the kind of games that are going to make you feel told off for ripping off an entire, or paying homage to an entire plot from the last 100 years of cinema. Yeah. These are all games where you can quite happily play through the Tales from the Crypt movie, or an episode of The Avengers, or whatever the case may be. And I think that that's wonderful that they all have their own audience, and people seem very delighted to have those games.
Yeah, I also really like the fact that all the character archetypes are mix and match. So if you really want to pull a character archetype from the spy movie, let's say, into the 1950s, you can very easily do that. Or you can pull kind of a normal person, if you want, into the fantasy, which emulates a lot. Like, often in fantasy movies, especially some bad ones, there is your everyman character. You're like, like this guy doesn't know how the world works, so we have to explain it to him, because that's how we explain it to the audience.
Yeah, right. Or something like, like the Cyclops Cave has the puppet archetype, which is kind of the someone you couldn't obviously put into like minimal prosthetics, and you could pull that in something like a Beneath the Sea thing of like, to play, I don't know, a 10 robot dog if you wanted to.
A robot dog?
Yeah.
Had anybody ever thought about that before?
It's a whole new concept I just came up with.
I really want to play Orko at some point using the puppet because I'm a big Masters of the Universe fan.
Well, yeah, the Masters of the Universe cartoon it hasn't held up that well, not so much as the, I guess, later iterations, especially She-Ra, but the Masters of the Universe movie it's an isekai movie. It's a movie where Courtney Cox and family get pulled through to Eternia and vice versa. He-Man ends up in Earth, and that is Cyclops' cave mixed with classified in a lot of ways. I think there's FBI agents running around. I ran a long classified game which had a mystic from Beyond the Grave in it, sort of Jane Seymour's character from Live and Let Die. And I think there was a G-Man from Beneath the Sea as well. So, it's not something we've advertised. Sometimes I kick myself, not literally, that would be silly, but I kick myself from a design perspective from not advertising that in a large way. I think it's something we've come to realize as developers, much as the audience has, that everything in They Came From is crossover compatible. All of the archetypes, all of the tropes, all of the cinematics, all of the quips, all of them can be used across game lines, and the game completely supports that. And we haven't, as far as I know, ever made a big song and dance about the fact that you can, but maybe we will. Maybe we will at some point. We keep mentioning it in interviews and podcasts. So hopefully they've got the message by now.
Maybe we could do like an actual play where it's specifically kind of like, they came from the multiverse kind of thing.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Everyone, everywhen, all at nothing.
Also, I just love that you can, because mixed genre movies are a thing. You can be like, okay, I'm making a dark fantasy movie.
Yeah.
And then you can put those two things together. So you can have, villains from Beyond the Grave in your fantasy movie along with fantasy villains and whatever. And that's, you could do your Evil Deads that way, right? Or your Army of Darkness, really. But that'd be really, really easy to do. And I think that's super cool.
One of the things I've been wanting to do when we get back into in-person conventions is I want to run a Men in Black movie franchise game mixing They Came From the Sea with Classified, because they work beautifully to emulate that.
It's something I would love to hear about more people doing. I'm sure more people will as time goes on. And I think it's one of the game's greatest strengths. And antagonists perfectly crossover compatible. I used the Bride of Dracula in Classified, not as a vampire, but I used her special rules for like a hypnotist, a mesmerist antagonist, because that all pretty much functioned. All she had to do was not drink blood. And all of a sudden she was a nocturnal hypnotist. And it worked perfectly well in a game of spies and private eyes, which isn't that game.
And really, I think we could all benefit from the rule of just don't drink blood.
Vampires might struggle.
I was gonna say, that might wipe out vampires entirely. Also mosquitoes.
Is that really a bad thing, though?
Well, the vampires might think so.
What do they know?
But so how does the tone, Matthew, shift between the games? And I do want to say before we really get into that answer is these are the way I've been pitching these since the first one is, it's MST3K, the role-playing game.
Yeah.
Because you do need to come into it with a meta attitude, which is often discouraged in role-playing games.
Yeah.
Right? Because usually you're like, well, I know that, my character doesn't. But in these games, your character still doesn't know those things, but you have to use your knowledge of the world to affect the world. So they're actors in a movie. They think they're in a serious problem issue, thing going on. And so that's part of what I love about this game, is that with things like rewrites and quips and stuff, you can manipulate it in a way that you can't in a lot of role-playing games, which we also do have in the Trinity Continuum with thematic editing. But that's a different conceit, because of that one you're kind of pulling from the multiverse right next to you to be a little cooler. And in this one you're like, no, it is actually a rubber suit, or we have killed the extra, etc.
Mhm.
But yeah, so what are the tones over the 4 kind of core games, and how did they shift when you were developing all 4 of them? Because it is something that I think you're very good at. Like, if you read the different fiction and the introductions and kind of the setting for each of them, they're all have really different feels for the eras, which I think is cool.
Yeah, well, that's by design. It's one of the biggest challenges in developing these games is actually making a consistent tone in each core book. And Beneath the Sea is farce. It's camp, it's silly, it's red. There's a certain healthy dose or unhealthy dose of red scare in there as well because of the era. Yeah,
right, exactly.
And it's one of those things where, in retrospect, there's some of that I wish we had toned down more. But I think the 1950s Beneath the Sea era is very. It's your characters can see absolutely nonsense things going on and are supposed to play it utterly straight, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably the one that is most clearly MST3K based, B-movie based, where the monsters are supposed to look cheap and rubbery and the costumes are falling apart. So tone in that is certainly farce. Beyond the Grave is camp, but hammy. This is the game where villains are going to be monologuing. This is the game where characters are going to be fainting. There's a lot of melodrama played up for humor in Beyond the Grave. I would say Beyond the Grave is the one that's least explicitly funny. It still has comedy in it, but there's also a dark humor to it as well. And I would suggest as well that Beyond the Grave is the one that puts most of the power in the director's hands for what scale do you want this humor to be on, because as Eddy and I and Danielle discussed in a Lunch and Crunch not that long ago, horror and comedy have very similar inroads, and they also have very similar barriers in the way that you have X cards, lines, veils, and so on with horror. People often have a preferred tone of comedy, and they will often have a sort of comedy they don't like to deal with. And Beyond the Grave is the one that walks the finest line, and I think dictates that the director speaks with the players beforehand. Do you want this to be gross out Evil Dead 2? Because Evil Dead 2 is a funny movie. But it's also a horrific movie.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I still think it's camp. I still think it's hammy, but it also requires a certain managing. Classified tone is innuendo. It is bureaucratic humor, which doesn't necessarily sell itself off the page. But if you are fans of movies where people don't necessarily know what job they're performing and what the sort of end goal is, I think there's a lot of that in Classified, which in a sense lends itself to dystopian movies like Brazil and dystopian games like Paranoia. There's a fair amount of that in Classified as well. But a lot of it does go back to innuendo and a certain counterculture attitude as well, because the people in grey suits, the stuffed shirts, are generally the bad guys in a Classified game. Your character is going to be a little more freewheeling and exciting and be driving around in open-top cars, wearing jumpsuits and the like. And then you've got Cyclops' Cave, which I would suggest is, well, that's an interesting one. I think it's the most...
It's probably the lightest of all of them, I would
say. It's the lightest humor because it has a certain amount of slapstick. Because there's the mechanical aspect of monsters looking slow and stolid, as they're stop motioned. Actors who don't necessarily know what they're doing, they're just there to look the part. They are there for the muscles, not for the expressions.
Right. They were there for the free trip to Italy.
Yeah, almost certainly.
Like Christopher Plummer was.
Yeah. And yeah, I think there's also, and I know I keep using the word camp, but I think camp is what runs through all of They Came From more than anything else.
Yeah.
Because Cyclops' Cave spans such a massive era, almost a century in length, The humor I most closely look to is Hercules and Xena, the legendary journeys. Xena more than Hercules, because the combat often, the comedy often comes through the combat. It comes through clonking things on the head and making a blang sound. It's almost 1960s Batman-esque in a lot of ways, Xena. There's still some tongue-in-cheek humor. There's a lot of poking at fun at the man. The man in this case will often be the gods or monsters or wizards that are above you. So I know that's a very long and meandering answer. I've never been able to deliver a short one on any subject.
No, you haven't.
And actually, you did skip over one because we haven't talked about it yet, but They Came From Beyond the Grave also has a supplement, which is Camp Murder Lake, which is slasher films.
Yep.
And one of the things that I thought you did really well with that was that you not only you took that horror that very finely walked line you talked about and added the self-awareness that was starting to creep into 80s horror cinema at the time, where like the characters were characters that may have grown up with horror cinema like us, so they were at least somewhat aware of the tropes, so that meta line got a little bit blurred in Camp Murder Lake. There's some really good horror films in the 80s, which Camp Murder Lake is based on, where there is a meta commentary. I think Return of the Living Dead has characters referring to watching Night of the Living Dead at one point. In lots of horror movies, people are watching Night of the Living Dead because it's royalty free. And I think one of the latter Friday the 13th as well. The humor in Camp Murder Lake, well, the word camp is in the title this time, but there is a certain bawdiness. There is a more grotesque humor in Camp Murder Lake as well. I would say a lot of people say They Came From is perfect for one-shots. I defy that every time I run it, because I often run multiple parts and end up falling into a campaign. But Camp Murder Lake is the best one, in my view, for a one-shot. Because everyone's going to die.
Yeah, exactly. If you want to emulate a camp-based horror movie, it makes a certain amount of sense that people are going to die in sequence from around the halfway mark. Pick off NPCs before then, and then say your gloves are off. Player characters can die now, but the good news is they can come back as zombies or slashers or specters. So they don't have to walk off to the bar,
or they can walk off to the bar, which is your favorite thing to do at a convention.
Yeah. If I was playing it, I'd say no, my character's dead, and just off I'd go because I'm a bad loser. But and of course we've got Danger Zone as well. They Came From the Danger Zone is probably the one the fewest people will know about at this time, because it's still being written. Well, it's still being developed. It's in development now. And this is an expansion, in theory, to both Classified and Cyclops' Cave. It takes a bit from both, more Classified than Cyclops, in its action movies. And so it has everything from the Arnold Schwarzenegger action movies, which is, I guess, its strongest origin point. And also the origin of quips, really, in cinema.
Kind of.
But it also takes quite a lot from the exploitation action movies, because damn it, I have to fit exploitation movies in every single one of these games, where they're made very much on the cheap for bargain buckets in gas stores and the like. And the movie I place as the strongest reference point for Danger Zone isn't Top Gun, despite the name. It's a movie called Stone Cold, which is piss poor. It came out in 1991, so past the actual high point of these, I guess, ultra testosterone fueled action movies, and yet it looks like something from 10 years prior. It is a wonderful combination of everything great about action movies and everything terrible about action movies, all crammed together. There's helicopter crashes, there's strip clubs, there's biker joints, there's barroom brawls, there's miniguns, there's Lance Henriksen, because frankly he would just take the work.
Sometimes you jump.
Yes. Don't begrudge him that at all. He's delivered some fine B-movie roles. It's and a bike. The main villains are a biker gang who do appear in a form in They Came From the Danger Zone.
Nice.
So yes, lots going on. Lots of they came from. So we're an industrious line.
Yeah, no, I am a fan of the concept of Danger Zone, which has gone through a couple of iterations, but now it's solidified.
Yeah.
And yeah, it is definitely that kind of cheesy 80s action movie. But you're absolutely right about a lot of quips originating with Arnold. Like how many people, quote the one line from Conan, or come with me if you want to live, or I'll be back, or whatever. Like I knew all of those quotes before I saw any of those movies. Because they were just in the culture. Like, I'll be back was everywhere after, like everywhere.
To the point that he still says it in the latter Terminator movies where he appears for 10 minutes.
Yep.
Which at this point, I mean, those movies aren't particularly good, but it makes them worse that he's saying it because everyone else is playing it completely straight. This is a horrible horror action dystopian movie. And then you've got Arnold Schwarzenegger coming in to say his line and
he
then
said the
walk.
thing. He said the thing.
Exactly. I'm clapping. He said the thing.
He said the thing.
Amazing.
Yeah.
If
yet not.
If anybody wants more information on the movie Stone Cold without having to watch the movie Stone Cold, there's a really good episode of the podcast, How Did This Get Played? Or sorry, how did this get made is the movie one. Played is the game one. But yeah, there's a really good episode of that about Stone Cold, which I have listened to, and it's very funny. So yeah. So let's get into specifics a little bit. And let's actually talk about our MST3K collab for a second because that's
yeah.
Oh well, you know what? I've been talking at a breakneck pace. So Eddy, why don't you talk about the MST3K collab while I have a drink?
Yeah, so Matthew takes a breath. So Mystery Science Theater did another Kickstarter last year, I think, at this point.
Yeah.
To put together another season of their show, but this time also they wanted to do their own streaming platform called the Gizmoplex. And one of the reward tiers on that was you could basically pay to advertise on the show, basically pay to become an advertiser, which is how advertising works, but doing it through the Kickstarter thing, which I thought was pretty clever.
Yeah, we're like sponsoring them essentially.
Yeah. And so it was we pay them a certain amount of money and then they make commercials and they run the commercials during the shows. It's like, okay, great. Rich is, of course, a huge Mystery Science Theater fan, as kind of Matthew alluded to, because
I am
really
too, so yeah.
that Rich kind of helped dial in that particular vibe during BTC. So we talked about it and he said, yeah, this is great. And now we have 4 commercials that they have made for us for Mystery Science Theater, 3 of which I think are online right now.
Yep.
The 4th one's coming soon.
They all have Tom Servo and Crow playing the game.
Yeah, and they
costumes.
They have them playing the game and doing stuff. And we had some discussions during the script phase, so we can kind of make sure that it was accurate to the game and whatnot. Because the canon of that they came from line is very important to Matthew. He has to rule it with an iron fist.
Yeah, so you'll see how important the canon is if you have looked at the setting chapters in each subsequent They Came From after Beneath the Sea. Where we wrote a quite lengthy setting and era description for Beneath the Sea, and then completely dropped that idea for all subsequent They Came Froms. Canonicity is a very important thing for me.
Yeah, isn't Beneath the Sea canonically set in Delaware?
Yes, there is a Delaware setting. That I say that I mock my own work, our own work. But Zombie Stalin does show up again in Classified. He is referenced in Classified. And I think one of the briefings is, well, we don't want a repeat of that Brain Eater Eel incident in Moscow. And there's the Glowing People antagonists, who are one of the very first ones written for the outline in Beneath the Sea, have appeared in each subsequent They Came From under a different name and slightly different forms, and you can still tell it's them because they have the exact same special rules, I think, with a couple of tweaks. They've still got a hallucinogenic gas and a net, and that's basically their means of attacking people, regardless of the game in which you're playing.
But I'm digressing a bit, but I mean, to me, I always viewed that more like how films are made, right? It's like when you don't have the licenses for films, a lot of filmmakers will still put in sideways nods to films that inspired them or films they're making fun of. That's a very common thing. So I very much read along the lines of like, this is, you have things like Doctor Who and Blake Seven used to do this off films a little bit. But I mean, they would have little Easter eggs or props that they would move between the sets, and everyone involved in making them knew what the references were, and really hardcore fans could find them and go, "Oh, you can connect these dots," but they were never meant to seriously in the same canon,
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, honestly, I can't go into too much detail about the Mystery Science Theater stuff in terms of business side, but I mean, just creatively, they were very excited about it, it seems. And the scripts most of our notes were just, like specific details. I mean, the actual jokes were great. And of course, absolutely expect. And the commercials have been just a hoot to watch, frankly.
Yeah, I'll say like as a longtime MST3K fan, like I grew up on it and I enjoyed all the new stuff when it was coming out.
Yep.
Like, it's just cool seeing them like holding a book that has my name in it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's like, look at that. I edited that book, and now Jonah's holding it on TV.
No, trust me. My wife was a member of the original fan club back when you had to mail in to get the card and all that, and she had the card for the longest time. So I mean, it was definitely a huge hit. One of the few times I think my wife was interested in my work, so that was good.
Just throw it right under that bus. No,
no, Michelle's very supportive.
Yeah. So I know that part of the reason that it's the three of us on this panel is because all of us have worked on the games.
Yeah.
Eddie, what have you done across the They Came From lines?
What have you done?
So what have you done? Really, that is the correct way to pronounce that question. So Matthew has shuffled me on all the books, which I find actually interesting. So I've kind of touched every part of the game at this point, although through different books. So I did the rules chapter for Beneath the Sea because Matthew figured I was the person who most knew Story Path at that moment, but also wasn't actually actively designing the system. So that way I wasn't going to be falling into old traps. I could look at the stuff with a relatively fresh eye, but still I could make meaningful conversation. We had some conversations like, hey, your original outline said this, but I think we want to nudge the rules to that.
Yeah.
Like, I think I pitched the renaming of momentum to rewrites, for example.
Yeah, and I remember I was pretty forceful on the subject of health and injuries, or on how that translates in the They Came From line, so that you actually get more effective the closer to death you get.
Yeah, and that was a good call, honestly.
I mean, that's how movies work too. Like,
exactly.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, so that was really, really fun. And then for Beyond the Grave, I did I did the quips. I remember that because I watched a lot of movie trailers. It was a YouTube channel that just had 70s horror film trailers.
Yeah.
And I watched that for like 4 hours. And
that was a hit with the writing team on that book.
It was great.
I have to interject if anybody has not seen the Beyond the Grave trailer.
Oh, yes.
I have seen it so many times and I laugh every single time. It's like 6 minutes long, so it's way too long.
Oh, very
which
much
adds
so.
to the humor.
Right.
And it's so freaking funny. It's on the Onyx Path YouTube. You can find it really easily. But like if you haven't seen it after this panel, do yourself a favor and check it out because it's so silly. Right. And every time I watch it, I laugh. Like it has never not made me laugh. So
absolutely,
it's the man getting eaten by the window, I think.
Yes.
Also, just like I said, the fact that it's so long and like certain things keep coming back, and like I think the candles always get me.
Yes.
But yeah, no, it's really good.
Absolutely. And then I did for Camp Murder Lake, I did the scenario kind of cards. I forget what we called them. But basically you pick a location, a person, and an action, and you use those as kind of a way to twists. That's what it was.
Yes.
They were initially designed for like Matthew wanted to be kind of here's the plot twist, but then actually having physical twists that could be played and adjusted through gameplay. And I realized, this is also used for like quick scenario creation. You make a few draws, kind of roughly put them in order, and there's your scenario. And then for classified, what did I do on classified?
Did you do the director's chair? Maybe?
That was it, right? Yes, because we talked about the genre and specifically dialing in the 60s aesthetic, and how to all the doubles and triple twists and all that stuff, and also how to handle innuendo respectfully at your table.
Right.
Which was something that after I wrote that, I started to realize that a lot of discussion around safety tools does really center around horror gaming specifically, and well, that it should. I'm glad that it started there. But Matthew is absolutely right that it's just as needed for funny comedic games, not even in the making sure everyone's comfortable sense, although that's a huge part of it, but also what does everyone find funny? Because like if I rank a They Came From game with one group of people, I mean, I might just lean into dick jokes because that's really what that group wants. Whereas another group might really much more go for the dry meta humor.
Yeah, and that's also really useful if you're playing with strangers, obviously.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because like I don't like toilet humor personally. It just grosses me out. So if somebody was leaning too hard to that, I'd be like, oh, I'm not having fun. This isn't funny to me. You know?
I once played a Shadowrun game where it had nothing to do with Shadowrun. Where the GM thought it would be hilarious if my character was trapped in a toilet cubicle, evacuating until I could succeed on some kind of constitution-based roll that I wasn't very good at. And he thought it was hilarious, and I was just sort of sat there rolling. And in the end, I just said, you know what? This isn't for me. I'm supposed to be decking into things right now. This doesn't feel like Shadowrun in the slightest, or funny. But again, that's a matter of taste or lack thereof. Some people, there may well be a group out there that wants to spend the entire session defecating, if that in character. And if that's the case, all power to them. Have fun with your game. I'm not going to join your group.
Yeah, I don't want to be in that game. Like, and I mean, I clearly don't mind, some crass humor, as evidenced by the first time that we ran that came from Beneath the Sea. I think at Virtual HorrorCon the first year, maybe, because as was mentioned the other day in our other panel, Ian was running that game for myself, Wes, Meredith, and Jacob Burgess, and like. It was just we barely got to the monster because it just turned into a slice of life game of the four of us in a boat traveling for 2.5 hours because we were all making each other laugh so hard.
Yeah.
Like, we had the perfect straight man in Jacob for me and Wes to be ridiculous. It was really fun. And we barely actually rolled dice for the most part. We just improv'd for 2 hours. But it was because the game really worked for us, and also all of our senses of humor worked together.
Right.
I think that's one of the merits of something that's explicitly a comedy game, or at least gives you the room to make it such, is that you can improvise, you can go off piste, and you don't have to complete the plot in order for it to be an entertaining few hours.
Right.
I was running They Came From Camp Murder Lake at as the inaugural game at Virtual HorrorCon this year, and the group escaped the sanitarium within the first hour. That's not what was supposed to happen, but I wasn't going to punish them for rolling well and coming up with good ideas. So it ended up a game where the characters were on a road trip, stopped at a dirty dive bar, decided that because they'd stolen a James Brown impersonator's van, they were going to pretend to be a punk fusion band, because none of them actually liked funk, and they just wanted to shout at people. So they decided they would play music for their lodging.
They were like hucking tambourines at people in the audience.
Yeah, shouting, "Give us your money!
Give us your money!"
And they rolled successfully, so that the bikers in the bar enjoyed it. There was then a melodramatic moment where one of the characters realized the barman was actually his father.
I had to leave for the panel, so I never got to that part. Like I got to the concert part, and then that's why I asked you later what happened, because I was like, I need to know how it ended because I had to go be on my panel.
Well, all of this said, we got to about halfway through and there wasn't anything really that horrific going on. So in the end, I had to reintroduce the slasher, the spirit of funk, essentially, and inhabiting people and making them turn into sort of zombie James Browns. And in the end, the characters fled. They ended up at the most popular cottaging site in Indiana. And they decided they would use all their rewrites at that point to have Dio, Ozzy Osbourne, and a bunch of other musicians show up at that crucial time where they were confronted by the slasher to fight off the funk with the power of punk. And so it ended up with a musical number,
Why
really.
did they get Ozzy Osbourne and Dio for punk? Those aren't punk musicians.
Because they were very stupid characters. They just liked anything that was shouting into a microphone, I think. And come the conclusion, only 2 characters died, which is pretty woeful for a slasher, but it was still a very entertaining game. And that's the point. They came from isn't always going to be hilarious, isn't always going to be horrific, or whatever the genre may be, but it should always be entertaining.
Yeah.
And more than any other game, and perhaps I can only say this with confidence because I know how to run these very well, because, it comes with, I guess, being the developer, it is that I have never ran a game of They Came From where the players have gone away not feeling entertained. And I can say that with confidence. It may sound arrogant, but I can say it because if I run this in person, people are always smiling at the end of the game, not because it's finished, but because they had a good time.
Oh, thank God.
And people actually get back in touch with me and say, we really loved that. And so many games I run, especially horror ones, they're good. People like them, but they're also things you put down afterwards and then get on with your life.
Right.
They Came From leaves you elated. You come away with it thinking that was a really fun 3 hours. And honestly, there are too few games that have that as a principle of design.
Right.
And in my view, and I'm so glad that They Came From manages it.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I love about it is the fact that you explicitly have permission to be silly.
Yeah.
Because often, I mean, if you're playing D&D, even playing Vampire or whatever, sometimes silly things happen and the table gets silly. And then there's always that moment where you have to be like, okay, guys, all right, come on, let's get back to the plot. Like, let's play the game. Even though the players are clearly having a better time riffing for a second than they are playing the game. But of course, the DM and some of the other players might want to move the game along, and it becomes a whole thing. Whereas in this game, it's like, everyone just gets to be silly if they want to. If somebody wants to play a straight man, they totally can.
And that makes it better.
Yeah.
As per your example with Jacob and co, when you've got a character who is playing it, or player who is playing the character absolutely straight and everyone else is just fooling around them, that works for the genre, because it's usually that person who is the protagonist who's trying to solve the mystery while everything else is nonsense.
Yeah, no, Jacob and Meredith learned about the merits of being a Louisiana swamp person. And Wes and I were Louisiana swamp people.
Oh, there you go.
I'm sure there are some. Yeah.
But actually, that leads to a question I have, since you've run so much of this now, Matthew. I mean, we talked about the fact that there's a very thin line between horror and humor, and a lot of horror game advice is to try to set the mood, make sure you have creepy music on, turn the lights low, try to get people into that mindset.
Right.
Have you found that by giving explicit permission to be funny, that the horror parts of these games actually stand out better as a result?
That's a really good question. I think it does work, not just for horror. It works as a point of contrast to whatever you're bouncing off of. And that's the wonderful thing about genre movies. If you've got a genre and then you add comedy to it, in theory, anything can be parodied.
Right.
And so as soon as players know that their characters can do silly things, or they as players can make their characters do silly things, whether it's through use of their quips at inappropriate moments or cinematics to make the game go gonzo bananas and so on, it makes the moments where you actually play to genre feel more, I guess, pertinent. They stand out more. And that isn't by design. That's not, I wasn't thinking, wouldn't it be great to contrast comedy against this? But it is a natural effect. Now, you need to be careful, I would suggest, if you are a director, a GM, who is coming in to run this, and let's say your first game is Beyond the Grave or Camp Murder Lake, the tonal whiplash that can occur, especially with horror, if you go from ha ha ha, these people are being stupid, and oh my god, this person's being eviscerated, can actually be unsettling to the player group, which is again why it's worth checking in advance. Where do you want to go with this? What are your limits and so on? But when it works, and it works more often than not, I think it emphasizes both ends of that spectrum to strong effect. I like to think so.
Well, that's one thing I was thinking about, because like even looking at humorous horror films, like you guys talked about The Evil Dead as an example, or Army of Darkness. I would argue Army of Darkness is more Cyclops Cave at that point, because it's a little more fantastical. The Evil Dead has some genuinely horrific stuff that happens in it.
Yeah.
But if you compare it to, like, say, the Scary Movie franchise, there's almost nothing that's actually scary in any of those movies, because it's all just a parody of the tropes. Really.
No, I would say Scream is a better Beyond the Grave, Camp Murder Lake game than Scary Movie, because there is still a lot of humor, and there's definitely meta currency in Scream. It's arguably the horror movie that introduced it in a major way,
It's like one of the first horror movies that people saw where the characters knew about horror movies.
Exactly.
Right. The self-awareness that's touched on in 80s slasher film became fully text as opposed to subtext.
Yeah, I mean, there's an entire section where Jamie Kennedy is explaining how horror movies work to everybody.
Yep, absolutely.
While they're watching, I think, Halloween?
I think so.
Yeah, I think they did actually. Yes, I'm pretty certain they had the rights to Halloween, and it wouldn't surprise me if Nightmare on Elm Street gets referenced, given that it is a Wes Craven movie. But it's Scream is a fantastic example of that. The Evil Dead trilogy and TV series, I've not seen it, but I'm sure it's good, are really great examples of how to balance horror and comedy. But again, it's a high watermark for gross out humor. You can do it with more subtlety. I think you'd run into more problems as a director trying to run a game that is explicitly based off a more comedy than horror film, like Young Frankenstein, as an example. Because most of us aren't comedy writers. This is where the paradox of They Came From comes in. You let players and the director find the humor rather than writing the humor in. You write your game as horrific, and then you let silly things happen. If you set up jokes and punchlines, it won't necessarily function as well.
I mean, when I was Beyond the Grave, I did put some silly things in there, but that's because it's funny.
But it's a bit like the advice I give to Pugmire writers, which is like don't put the punchline on the page. Let the players find that punchline.
Yeah.
Right.
So like to Dixie's point, it's like, there's some funny stuff on the page, but I always read that more as aspirational. Like, here's some things to kind of get you started, but then let the players riff off those and find their own humor from that point on.
Yeah. No, I was very pleased. Like I have only really written on Camp Murder Lake and Beyond the Grave. Which makes sense because that's more my wheelhouse. But like, I did about a third of the antagonists for Beyond the Grave.
Yeah.
And I had so much fun writing those. Just to be like self-indulgent for a second here.
There
was recently a review someone did of Beyond the Grave, and they were talking about all the different antagonists. And I got to feel very special because they called out the fact that they usually hate zombies as antagonists, and they loved the way that I wrote zombies.
Oh, excellent.
Because all I did was adapt a rant I used to go on when fast zombies became a thing about how one zombie should never be scary.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I just like adapted that into the actual characters. Where it's like one zombie's not scary, 10 zombies maybe, 100 zombies. Now we're talking.
Yeah.
You know, because zombies aren't scary because they might bite you. Like if you look at Shaun of the Dead, for instance, there's a scene where they're just walking slowly away from a zombie because like one zombie isn't scary.
Right.
Now I am totally fine with fast zombies now, but for a while I was on my high horse about
Me too.
how fast zombies sucked. Which I no longer think, but it is something that George Romero used to sign on things like
fast zombies suck.
I think he was doing it ironically by
sure.
Yeah. But yeah, so like I got to feel very special because I've written a few things for it and they got praised and that was cool.
Well, also, I mean,
as just with my antagonists.
You weren't you the one else did the devil himself gag?
I no, I was the only one. I was the one who gave permission to put it in all caps.
Oh, okay.
Yes, because as the editor, one of the rules in our style guide is that we never use caps for emphasis.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the one in the Slack who was like, "Can we put the devil himself in caps every single time?" And everybody was like, "Yes." And I'm like, "Yes, it's gonna look great," and it does. It does look great. As I said, we've only got a couple minutes left, so I will throw it to Matthew if you have any final thoughts on They Came From, and also want to plug, where people can talk to you about it.
Oh, well, let's think. Do I have any final thoughts? I'm sure I can dig something out of that.
Piece of advice, things on tone. If you want to listen to a much creepier version of They Came From, the Red Moon role-playing group, with Matthew, has a much more serious game of it, which is very cool too. If you want to use the rules to play not comedy.
Yeah, so if you want examples of how to run They Came From, of course, there's lots of people who have ran it now and have put it on their channels. I have ran every They Came From core for Red Moon role-playing at some point. Beneath the Sea, Beyond the Grave, Classified, and Cyclops' Cave. The Beneath the Sea game, as Dixie pointed out, is something of an anomaly because it's dealing with Beneath the Sea as a serious game. It's a bit Lovecraftian, bit cosmic horror-y, where the players are essentially the great old ones and the characters that are unknowing vessels. And so some of the quips you get are just gibberish streams with lots of apostrophes and hyphens. And whenever you use one of these quips, essentially the great old one takes over the body of the character, and once the scene is over, the character can't remember what just happened. So that was kind of an experiment for myself to prove that Beneath the Sea could be run using the same mechanics, but in a deadly serious fashion. But there's lots of fun Beneath the Sea games out there as well. I know Travis Legg ran a very popular one for the Story Path Showcase that's on the Onyx Path YouTube channel. I've, as I said, Beyond the Grave, we've got a session on Red Moon Role-Playing. Classified in the Cyclops' Cave one are really interesting because I had the same cast for each actual play, and they're even playing basically variations on the same character. So essentially they're playing the same actor in each one. And both movies or both games start with pretty much the same opening. And it's, that was a really experimental, but again, fun thing to do. My advice to anyone running is, as ever, don't prescribe your humor. Don't expect everyone to be a comedy genius, because they're not. Most of us aren't. And don't expect everyone to be able to improvise lightning fast. The whole reason quips come on cards, cinematics come on cards, is because it's a lot easier to remember to use something if it's there right in front of you. Right. Whether you've got it electronically on one of your monitors or whether you've got it in front of you as a card, playing it is a really satisfying way of not only feeling accomplished that you did something, it will add punctuation to your humor, especially if it's in an appropriate sentence. If you play it and it is utterly inappropriate, people may not laugh unless you slam it down on the table, at which point it just seems utterly nonsense. And the last thing to plug, as we will be wrapping up, is you can get Beneath the Sea and Beyond the Grave through traditional print venues now, friendly local gaming stores, Indie Press Revolution and Studio 2. You can also buy them on DriveThruRPG, along with Camp Murder Lake, and a huge array of source books now, many of which are micro tasty bits that only cost a couple of dollars but have fantastic material. And Classified and Cyclops Cave are still on backer kits. You can pre-order them in traditional print formats. So please consider doing that. Especially, I'm going to do a big shout out to Michele's work on Cyclops Cave, because he did a wonderful job for his, I think first development gig. And what an amazing co-developer he was. So do support our games if you can. I would be grateful for any feedback that you have about your experiences playing They Came From.
And where can people find you?
They can't.
Oh, okay. All right.
Just send a post, a letter. Don't put an address on it; it'll get to me.
So you have those business cards that are massive, but there's no contact information.
I'm
anywhere.
like Santa Claus. Just send it up the chimney.
I knew that if I threw this to Matthew with 5 minutes to go, we'd still somehow go over, and we have now. So thanks, Matthew.
All right. You can find me on MatthewDawkins.com. My full list of credits and my contact info is there. You can also find me on Twitter at DawkinsMP. You can find me in the Onyx Path Discord as Matthew Dawkins, often hanging around the They Came From channels like a bad smell.
Eddy, what about you?
You can find me on Twitter at Pugstady. It's PUGSTADY. You can find my website, pugstady.com. You can also find me on the Onyx Path Discord. Done.
You can find me in all those places as Dixie Cyanide generally. And if you want to check out the website that we did for They Came From at MC3K, it's theycamefrom.com. And you can find all of our other books at theonyxpath.com. So thank you very much for coming to the panel. And I hope you enjoyed it and play a They Came From game. Be silly.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.